The boardroom fell silent when she walked in, her worn-out briefcase squeaking against the polished marble floor. "Is this some kind of joke?" whispered an executive, eyeing her faded blazer. The young woman ignored them, arranging yellowed documents with care. Then she spoke, her voice steady, her words prescient. The room's energy shifted instantly. Faces that had smirked now watched in silent awe, the air thick with second guesses. The visiting CEO, known for ruthless efficiency, leaned forward, recognizing something deeper than the flashy deck any of them expected. She revealed not just numbers, but a legacy methods passed down through her family, sharpened by decades of hard lessons. As her words settled, the mockers sat in stunned silence, unsure how to process what they'd just witnessed. The briefcase sat on the table, its presence out of place among the sleek laptops and glass water bottles. Its leather was worn smooth at the edges, stretched by years of hands gripping it through cycles of uncertainty and triumph. Near the left hinge ran a hairline, cracked the exact spot where her grandfather's thumb had rested during tense negotiations, a mark that had deepened with every crisis weathered. She unbuckled the clasp, revealing the initials pressed faintly into the brass. The room watched as she opened the lid, exposing yellowed file dividers arranged by a system no one else recognized. One tab read, "Seasons," a nod to her family's habit of tracking business in rhythms rather than quarter spring for renewal, autumn for consolidation. Another tab simply said, "Tides," a reminder that markets, like oceans, could turn with little warning. A senior partner tried to lighten the mood. "Going analog today?" His cufflinks caught the light, but she gave no reply. Instead, she drew out 3 sheets of paper, their edges curled and ink faded to sepia. The numbers weren't just old, they were written in a hand that pressed deep into the fibers, a record of decisions made long before dashboards and instant analytics. One page bore a coffee stain, outlining shipping records from an earlier era, the kind of detail that marked the difference between a spreadsheet and a story. She paused, her finger tracing the notch carved into the briefcase's frame put there during a market crash, a silent cue to keep steady when others lost their nerve. The leather lining still showed the faint imprint of a fountain pen clip, worn in by years of Monday morning briefings. When she produced a slide rule, the room shifted. She slid the rule across the table like a scalpel no one dared question its place beside her notepad. The numbers she began to write flowed in the same slanted script her great-aunt had used to calculate interest rates during the leanest years. The scent of old leather and ink hung in the air, grounding the room in something older than quarterly reports. A corner of the briefcase held pencils, each sharpened to her father's preferred length, a quiet gauge of optimism. In the side pocket, a worn calendar bore annotations from 4 generations, notes layered over decades of cycles, each hand adding to the record. As she worked, the CEO noticed how her thumb brushed a small crack in the handly habit inherited from her mother, who once gripped it tight while facing down creditors. The plastic nameplate had faded, but the faint imprint beneath still read, "Hold fast." She set the briefcase aside, ready to show that the lessons it carried weren't relics, but tools for what came next. She began by speaking the language of preparedness, not with buzzwords or slides, but with the certainty of someone who had lived through patterns others only studied. She recited decades-old shipping manifests, exact weights, routes, delay so flawlessly that even the CFO paused his tablet. The numbers tumbled out, each one rooted in memory and repetition, not on a screen. A vice president reached for his phone to check her facts, but the CEO motioned for silence. He recognized the difference between someone reading and someone remembering. She moved next to an old storage rack diagram her family used in a post-war port warehouse. The paper, yellowed and soft at the creases, spread across the table. "Third shelf from the left," she pointed, tracing the pencil lines that mapped out where support beams bowed under weight. She showed how the sag in the middle beam signaled a weak point of detail her family had learned to spot before anyone else. "Your Chicago facility has the same stress pattern. Check the west wall." The operations manager's posture changed. He knew that wall had needed reinforcement just last month. A worn ledger landed on the table. Its yellowed pages bore her grandfather's red ink circle around risky dates, proof he'd faced crises like this before. She opened to a page dog-eared from years of reference and placed it beside the current quarter's logistics report. Late deliveries from the same suppliers, decades apart. "They'll fail you again when tariffs shift," she said, her voice even. The faint scent of tobacco clung to the paper, a reminder of nights her grandfather spent updating ledgers while storms rattled the windows. She held up a faded shipping label, the stencil barely visible, showing a route from Bremen to Boston by way of Cape Horn. "Notice the reorder stamp," she said, pointing to a purple mark. Someone had diverted the shipment mid-transit, evidence of just-in-time inventory before anyone called it that. The supply chain team leaned in. Their algorithm had recommended the same detour the week before. Last, she placed a set of hand-forged brass calipers on the table, the metal worn smooth by generations. She adjusted the tool to show a 3mm gap beside a modern plastic shipping container sample. "Your new supplier's tolerances are off by this much." The quality control head picked up the calipers, silent. Later, testing would confirm her measurement. Every defective batch matched the old tool's verdict. The room quieted, eyes drawn to the margin notes in the oil crisis ledger. The CEO lingered over a line written in a different hand, the ink faded but the meaning clear. The table waited, the air holding the weight of what had just been shown. The CEO leaned in, adjusting the focus until he could read the margin notes for himself. His cuff snagged on the edge of the table as he squinted at the script in the faded ink. "Those parenthetical check marks in the margins," he said quietly, his finger hovering above a cluster of symbols beside a 1,968 inventory list. "I haven't seen that notation system in years." He whispered the method's name, a hallmark of her family's practice. The CFO, halfway through a yawn, straightened, suddenly alert. She didn't offer an explanation, just smoothed the curling paper with her palm. The CEO mentioned a name that even the CFO knew from boardroom lore, someone whose influence lingered in footnotes and whispered advice. The COO's pen stilled mid-sentence. She nodded once. "He ate at our table every Thursday." Her finger paused over a coffee stain, a silent acknowledgement. "That's where he tested his theories before they ever made it to the market." The CEO let out a slow breath. He'd studied those theories in business school, but seeing them handwritten in the margins beside, reminders for groceries and dentist appointments, made them feel different, more lived in, more real. He turned the pages until a warehouse diagram surfaced, filled with arrows and circles looping in on themselves. "This wasn't in the published papers," he said, tracing the pencil lines. She tilted her head. "Granddad called those failure maps, places where shipments got stuck." Her nail tapped a cluster of X's near a loading dock. "Same pattern your Memphis hub showed last quarter." The logistics VP exhaled. They'd lost a fortune in Memphis from delays, and here was the same flaw, mapped out decades ago. The CEO slipped off his glasses and polished them, eyes lingering on the chalkboard behind Hearth, one nobody used anymore. "We paid consultants millions to solve that." She opened a hidden compartment in the briefcase. Inside, index cards bound by a rubber band. Each card held a date and a single sentence, written in different hands. The CEO read the top card aloud. "When trucks bottleneck, check the pallet jacks first. They're always the canary." The warehouse manager's face fell. Last month's audit had flagged the same problem. A phone vibrated on the table, ignored. She flipped to a card from 1,985. "If the receiving clerk remembers your name, double count the order." The procurement head shifted in his seat. They just fired a vendor for under-deliveries. The CEO set his glasses down. "You're sitting on 50 years of due diligence." She paused, looking around the table. "Not sitting," she said, her voice steady. "Carrying." The words lingered in the air. She wrapped the rubber band around the cards again, and the briefcase lock snapped shut. A junior analyst scrolled for confirmation, pulling up an old photo, two men beside a truck, one with the same half-smile as in the Polaroid tucked inside her case. The CEO glanced at the image, then at the stack of ledgers, as if seeing them for the first time. He didn't ask for projections or forecasts. He waited, knowing the next lesson would come not from a spreadsheet, but from the next artifact she would lay on the table. She placed a leather-bound notebook on the table, its spine creased and paper marked by years of use. Inside, A page from the autumn of 1973 showed handwritten supplier ratings, no formulas, just check marks and X's in faded ink, each mark a decision made during a crisis. The CFO compared the names to his compliance report. Bauer Steel, marked as a risk decades ago, still triggered alerts on his screen. The COO scrolled through their vendor database, pausing when those same names appeared again. The pattern was clear. The risks weren't new, they were cyclical, recorded by a hand steadier than any algorithm. She flipped to a clipping taped beside a list of local truckers, 3 names circled in pencil with "Will deliver" written next to them. The logistics VP leaned in, recognizing 2 of those carriers from last winter's emergency calls. The lessons didn't fade, they simply waited for someone to read them. When the conversation shifted to merger calculations, she reached for a cocktail napkin and drew 3 lines with a pencil: assets, amortization, acquisition costs. She ignored the calculator offered by the CFO. Her quick sketch revealed a hidden cost their model missed on, rooted in culture, not spreadsheets. The audit lead objected, but she pointed to a notation in the corner, a reference to a method older than any software in the room. The CEO nodded, remembering the same approach from his first years in banking. She brought out the same slide rule she'd shown earlier, the one with its scales worn smooth by decades of use. This time, she lined up the cursor and recalculated executive retention risk. The result matched their HR projections, but the method required no software, just an understanding of how risk echoes through time. The head of compensation watched, unsettled by the accuracy. The last item was a glassine envelope with carbon copies of inventory audits from the late 1960s. Each page bore coffee rings and check marks in green ink. She aligned one with a current warehouse report, and the same item numbers showed variance. What the loss prevention team called a new problem had already been solved once by staggered counts, long before any of them were hired. The COO closed his laptop, silent. The general counsel studied the binding, darkened by generations of hands. Only the junior analyst watched her hands, noticing how her knuckles tensed when she found inconsistencies, an echo of her grandmother's vigilance. She repacked the briefcase, the slide rule clicking into place beside a folded insurance map. The CFO reached out, then pulled back, understanding there are some weights you don't take lightly. Some gestures speak louder than apologies. The CFO lingered after the meeting, his hand tracing the reinforced stitching on the briefcase. He studied the bar tacks, quietly acknowledging the weight of tradition he'd once overlooked. "Bar tacked," he said almost to himself, recognizing the same pattern from his father's old duffel. She didn't answer. They stood in the hush of the empty boardroom for a moment longer, the conversation settling into shared understanding. No one named the earlier doubts, or the moments when her methods had been dismissed. The apology was silent, but it was there. At the holiday party, the intern who'd giggled during her first presentation approached with a glass balanced carefully in both hands. "Vermouth Cassie," she offered, as if reciting a password. "Your grandmother's favorite, right?" The glass was chilled, just so, the ratio of vermouth to cassis exact, the ice melt precise. She took a sip and nodded. The intern didn't linger, just smiled and slipped away, leaving the gesture to stand on its own. Across the room, the CEO noticed, his own glass held quietly, no longer mocking her taste for the old ways. People didn't say sorry, they found other ways to show it. The junior analyst who'd once dismissed her handwritten notes now arrived early, setting up the slide projector before meetings and asking about the best way to store carbon copies. The head of marketing, who had once tried to sidestep her with small talk, now listened closely when she spoke about the 1962 campaign, jotting notes in a battered legal pad instead of a tablet. The IT tech, who used to roll his eyes at her insistence on analog backups, quietly replaced the projector bulb before every quarterly review. No one brought up the first days when her briefcase and yellow documents had drawn side glances. The old resistance faded, replaced by small acts. A door held open, a question asked in earnest. A slide rule left on her desk with a note. "Thought you might use this more than I would." The change wasn't dramatic. It was steady, like the way a habit becomes routine. She noticed the difference most in the quiet. The way colleagues now paused before tossing out old files, The way the new analyst watched her organize ledgers. The way people lingered after meetings, waiting for a story or a tip. The apologies never came in words, but in the ways people began to value what had once been overlooked. It was in these moments, a glass set down with care, a question asked instead of a joke, that she realized the briefcase's weight was no longer hers alone. The shift was subtle, easy to miss unless you knew to look for it. And in that atmosphere, where tradition and curiosity finally found room to coexist, someone new began to take notice. The new analyst arrived early, always before the lights flickered on. She didn't just skim quarterly reports, she tracked down original ledgers, spread out carbon copies, and compared the numbers in the margins to the stories whispered between the lines. The briefcase's owner saw it all, the way the analyst lingered over glassine envelopes from the 70s, the careful tilt of her lamp to catch the impression where someone's pen had pressed too hard. One morning, the owner called her in before sunrise. They sat together at the end of a long table, the briefcase between them. The brass was dulled, the lock worn smooth by years of use. She taught her how to unlock it just right each twist and lift a ritual of trust. The analyst watched, hands steady, as the owner demonstrated the sequence, not rushed, not forced. The movement was practiced, almost silent. Inside, the owner pointed out the system for packing documents so nothing bent or tore. She showed the analyst a single coin tucked into the laninga, 1,943 mercury dime, thin and bright from years of being handled. "For decisions," she said. "You'll know when." The analyst turned the dime over in her palm, feeling the weight of something more than silver. The owner explained the care the briefcase needed. How to oil the hinges, how to check the stitching along the handle, how to keep the leather from cracking in dry seasons. She didn't list every rule, she showed the small habits that mattered. The analyst listened, repeating the motions, careful not to rush. When the analyst hesitated, hand hovering over the old ledger, she shook her head. "I can't take this." The owner placed her hand over the analyst's, guiding her fingers to the seam along the bottom edge. "Neither was I," she said. "That's why you will be." The briefcase wasn't just a toolet, was a record of mistakes, recoveries, and the quiet persistence that kept a business alive. The analyst closed the case, the latch making a new sound, unfamiliar, but sure. She rested her thumb on the handle's underside, where the patina had worn thin from generations of use. She opened the case again, slower this time, listening for the soft whisper of old paper and leather. The sun edged over the city skyline, catching the brass and throwing a pale reflection on the boardroom wall. The briefcase sat ready, waiting for the next story to begin. As the room settled into a quiet that felt almost like respect, a faded image of her grandfather's dockside office hung on the wall, shelves stacked with ledgers and battered scales. Modern dashboards can't calculate what those ledgers held. The weight of trust, the friction of a handshake, those aren't measured in spreadsheets. That briefcase is more than leather and brass. It's a centuries-old formula of trust and experience, refined through recessions and wars. The newest analyst feels that now, her fingers tracing the same groove worn by generations before her, where decisions were made in silence and with care. Some wisdom never updates. Some truths only travel through weathered hands. If you've ever found wisdom in yellowed pages, subscribe for more stories of legacy and grit.